Welcome to a new episode of InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Lots of people quote the Spanish philosopher George Santayana's warning that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Apparently, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is also supposed to have said something along those lines. My personal view is that if we didn't forget history, that is, if we ever bothered to read it in the first place, history would be linear and not cyclical. Or maybe it's like a bullet which has both linear and rotational motions. Be that as it may, there's also much talk nowadays about how we might just be sleepwalking into a major war, just like the European powers did in the First Great War or even the Second one. I don't think situations can exactly overlap, but there's some affinity between now and then in terms of how things are shaping up broadly. It was a witch's broth, and its ingredients included extreme forms and expressions of nationalism, imperialistic ambitions over territories of other nations, a complex web of alliances, and the incessant drumbeat of militarism, especially in Germany. And the corollary, the arms race, became a self-fulfilling prophecy, reinforced by the imperative to use the advantage while remaining ahead. Some of it does seem familiar today, even if we discount self-contained imperial empires of the past. Today is far more interdependent despite the seeming demise of neoliberal trade and the use of geoeconomics in the service of plain geopolitics, like, Cardinal Richelieu's raison d'etat. Today we have Ukraine, we have the Zionist entity's genocidal war in Gaza, its attacks in Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and then we have the civil war in the Sudan. We have territorial claims over Taiwan, contested access to rare earths and minerals, China emerging as the challenger, and its quest for global hegemony, and its alliances with Russia, North Korea, and Iran. The center of power shifting from the west to the east, emerging technologies, the entanglement of nuclear and conventional capabilities, the near demise of some foundational principles of international law. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I've got an historian to deal with this group, Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Niaz is an old and dear friend. I remember describing him some 13 years ago as young in age, but mature in his accomplishments. Since then, of course, he has penned 3 more books and his repertoire keeps expanding. He's also a professor of history at the Quaid-i-Azam University and author of several books, including Downfall, Lessons for Our Final Century, The State During the British Raj, Imperial Governance in South Asia from 1700 to 1947, Old World Empires, Cultures of Power and Governance in Eurasia, the culture of power and governance of Pakistan, and so on. And he has penned a number of scholarly papers, so that list is pretty long. So Ilhan, great to have you. We've been discussing this program actually now for almost a month, I think even more than a month. And of course, we've been discussing bilaterally most of these issues. So I thought, let's just get it done. And of course, it's very difficult to try and put everything together in a 30-minute program. But let's just try and see what the broader trends are. As I said, you can't have situations exactly overlapping situations in the past, but there are certain trend lines that seem kind of familiar. So let's just begin there in terms of how accurate it is to see the situation leading up to the First Great War or the situation leading up to the Second Great War with the situation unfolding now.
Okay, so it's very interesting because in several ways, the China and US emerging rivalry is comparable to what happened between Germany and the United Kingdom in the decade leading up to the First World War. Germany and the UK were big trading partners of each other. They had overall good cultural, educational, and other such relations for a long period of time. But when the Germans began to challenge the supremacy of the Royal Navy, that then led the English to abandon their old policy of splendid isolation from the continent and start seeking out alliances as a security guarantee against the rise of Germany. And there's a very famous memorandum in this respect penned by a British diplomat. It's known as the Crow Memorandum, in which he basically makes the argument that it is not Germany's intentions that are ultimately important. What is important is the capability that Germany has come to possess, economic, industrial, military, so on and so forth. So in that respect, when you look at China and the United States, you also see maybe the United States reprising the role of the United Kingdom as the old established power, and China emerging or re-emerging as a world power or a great power in its own right. And the Chinese, as they pursue their own national development, they acquire global interests, they acquire a certain standing in the world, and increasingly they come to be seen as a peer competitor of the United States in a wide range of fields. So this puts the United States into a very interesting problem, similar to that faced by British statesmen, that do they continue to allow this rise to continue unchecked, or do they attempt to stop this rise from continuing? Do they attempt to try and somehow derail this transformation, taking advantage of the fact that at present, despite China's modernization, the United States and its allies still enjoy a military preponderance over the Chinese? So this, of course, is a very old problem. It goes back to Herodotus and the crisis between Lydia and the Persian Empire, what later on becomes known as the Thucydides trap, that how exactly does a established power, the reigning champion, deal with an emerging champion? And this, in turn, leads to a heightened risk of conflict. Of course, there is one very important difference between the Anglo-German and, more broadly speaking, Central Powers and Entente Powers situation and the US and Chinese situation. One, of course, element of that is that both China and the United States are nuclear powers. So that imposes, one should hope, a certain level of restraint when it comes to trying to attack each other. Though, as India and Pakistan have recently demonstrated, you may not actually get that anymore. The other important thing is, and this is where perhaps we can have a bit more of a discussion, is that I think the Chinese leadership, the present Chinese leadership, is essentially missing the geopolitical moment. They are addicted to a kind of gradualism, and they have rationalized it so thoroughly that not doing anything while the United States and its allies essentially run rampage over the world, knocking the stuffing out of one actual or potential Chinese ally after another, the Chinese just sort of sit it out. The art of fighting without fighting kind of approach. And I have a feeling that this belies a underlying paralysis in the Chinese thinking, that it may have been saleable as grand strategy 5 or 6 years ago, but at this point, the Chinese thinking needs a lot of clarity. And I'll just give you an example of this, because I've been following Chinese social media and posts quite closely since the 4-day conflict between India and Pakistan. And just recently, Chinese netizens produced a 3D digital rendering of the air battle of May 6th, 7th between India and Pakistan.
Yes,
and although the commentary in places is quite cringeworthy, the way in which they portray what has happened essentially seems to indicate that they own that fight in a way that they would perhaps not have been previously willing to. But it also shows you an underlying timidity as well. That, when India backed organizations target Chinese citizens in Pakistan, the Chinese seem to chew Pakistan out for its security failures, but they don't seem to go after the Indians or the people who are actually backing the terrorist attacks against Chinese interests. So I think the Chinese, in this respect, they are maybe thinking that, we can avoid fighting a Cold War with the Americans. But what history teaches us is that if one party is determined on fighting a Cold War against you, you are in a Cold War, whether you like to admit it or not. So if you don't fight back, that's perfectly fine for the other side. They get a walkover. So I think these are the two things which I think distinguish the current instability from the previous instability. The underlying timidity, as I see it, of the Chinese leadership, and the nuclear posture of both the Chinese and the Americans, which would perhaps inhibit direct confrontation.
I'm happy that you made this point, because you know that you and I have had a discussion on this point. So we're going to have that discussion once again, because I have a different view of the Chinese strategy. But just to reinforce what you said, I just pulled up some of my notes. For instance, Herbert Asquith, who was the prime minister as the war broke out, as it happened, he was painting a pretty rosy picture of British-German relations. And this is a direct quote from what he said: "Public opinion in both countries seems to point to an intimate and friendly understanding," unquote. Then at the British Foreign Office, for instance, Arthur Nicholson was one of the diplomats. He said, "Since I've been at the Foreign Office, I have not seen such calm waters." But that was not what the Chief of General Staff, the younger Moltke, the way he viewed things, because this is like back in 1912, we declared, "I consider a war inevitable. The sooner, the better." So I just wanted to corroborate the point that you were making in terms of how the relationship was between Britain and Germany in the run-up to the war. Also, on your point with reference to the nuclear balance of terror, it's interesting that Professor Graham Allison, when he did that Harvard project, which ultimately came out as a book, The Thucydides Trap, he looked at 16 cases, out of which there were 4 cases where war did not break out. And one of the cases that he mentions is the US-led, order, and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, and that is where the balance of terror was held by the nuclear weapons. But coming back to what you said about the Chinese, why would you expend energies when you can see your adversary going into a high adrenaline drive, squandering money, squandering its geopolitical capital, even among its allies, while you are not wasting anything? You're just sitting on the sidelines and watching. You let your adversary make a mistake, in this case, multiple mistakes. You don't have to actually get into the fight.
During the 30 Years' War in Europe, France ultimately intervened on the side of the Protestant principalities against the Catholic Habsburg Empire. And Richelieu at the time was the French equivalent to a prime minister. And Richelieu made the case to his king that, like a great economist, having husbanded our strength, we need to now intervene in this conflict at this decisive moment. So the point of husbanding your strength is to ultimately seek a decision, because no empire, no world system is simply going to hand over the keys to a new owner without a fight over those keys. So I think in this respect, when you look at, let's say, the Soviet example, that is maybe a little bit misleading, because the Soviets and the Americans did fight a pretty hot Cold War against each other. So, yes, there was stability at the center, but there was a lot of violence all over the planet as the two struggled to carve out their respective spheres of influences and undermine each other's.
Which is
So,
what we call the instability stability paradox.
absolutely. So, in this respect, the Chinese, if they are not actually going to be willing to fight for the preservation of their sphere of influence, it means that the United States and its allies will ultimately prevent that sphere of influence from consolidating. And this is something which every great power has, of course, to ask itself, that, where do you actually draw the line? But I feel that at the current point, the Chinese do need to start playing more on the front foot. It's not enough for the Chinese just to sit with hands folded as, let's say, genocide unravels in Gaza, as Iran is decimated by the Israelis, as Russia is, in a way, ground down through attrition in the Ukraine. So the point to understand is that, well, at some point, uh, are the Chinese willing to actually draw their sword? Now, we know that Maoist China, with all its poverty and chaos, was willing to draw its sword. But China, since then, especially since perhaps the last 15, 20 years, does not seem willing to actually draw its sword in any serious way. So, this imposes a, I would say, limitation, because ultimately you can have all the best fighter planes in the world, like the Arab states do. But if you don't have the will to use it, if you don't have the courage, if you will, to go get into a fight, then what use is all of that fancy hardware? Putting on an impressive military parade, as Xi recently did, that's fantastic. But what good is that in terms of the fact that the US is now currently, for instance, trying to pursue a regime change operation in Venezuela, Maduro being an old ally of the Chinese and now being on the chopping block? So I think this is something which also then signals to other countries that, okay, fine, China can be a good economic partner. It can be a good, maybe, source of investment and maybe some other such things. But it isn't really a strategic partner, because it's not going to actually fight to preserve or expand a sphere of influence. And the
But
other side is, of course, guns blazing, willing to fight all the time to preserve and expand its sphere of influence.
no, I see lots of these points that you're making are very valid. But my central point, where I think, and this is the final point that I'm going to make before we move forward and not just get stuck in this, um, is that, I mean, you're an historian, obviously, a fantastic historian. You're the whole idea of the longue durée and all of that. But as an IR person, the way I look at it is that I have to structure the Chinese world into its core and peripheral interests. And its core interests, essentially, in terms of its own hemispheric influence, just like the Western Hemisphere for the United States is the East and South China Seas, and South China Seas right further down south to Oceania, and of course, on the west into the Indian Ocean. This is this is where its core interest lies, and then rest of the areas are peripheral, in the sense that, if something happens there, China will do diplomatic or make diplomatic noises and the rest of it, but It's not going to directly intervene because that's not the way it fights. But it can also then, as for instance in the case of Pakistan, which has proven itself, and I'm not saying, I mean, of course, we've been getting Chinese equipment and the rest of it, but the way we have developed how we want to fight is our own way. And in the Middle East, for instance, the United States, you and I know we've been, looking at it for the last 3 years or even more. The US has basically completely lost all credibility. And of course, it's going to take time for the countries of the Gulf and generally the Middle East to move away from the United States. But that time might be sooner than later. And since you mentioned Richelieu, husbanding the resources of France, he did get into a fight as a Catholic prince of the church, reaching out to the Swedish Protestant king in order to fight a Catholic empire. So that's the raison d'etat that I mentioned in my introduction. But the primary battleground was not France itself. It was the Germanic lands. So anyway, let's move on from this. Let's talk about, there was a lot of trade among European powers in the run-up to the First Great War. But the level of interdependence in terms of global supply chains was, I mean, today it's a completely different ballgame altogether. I mean, even with Trump's tariffs and the rest of it, now he realizes that there are things that China controls. For instance, the rare earth minerals, which it monopolizes, and it can just completely shut down the pipeline, which essentially means that nothing really gets built because it is the cocaine of the digital world. So keeping that in mind, keeping in mind the nuclear weapons also, keeping in mind a certain kind of symmetry that is developing in terms of capabilities, not just on the ground, but also the ISR capabilities and the space capabilities. Do you think there's likely to be some kind of understanding of respective spheres of influence, some kind of tenuous acceptance of balance, with Europe trying to create its own sort of, own sort of posture economically, also militarily, also the United States focusing on the Western Hemisphere and China focusing on its own core areas of concern?
Okay, so I think the key question here would be that would the United States still be willing and able to maintain its existing security commitments well into the future? If you look at NATO, for example, Trump's messaging from his first term has been quite clear that we need the Europeans to do a lot more of the heavy lifting. We need them to increase their defense spending. We need them to actually have armies that are capable of fighting, as opposed to simply hanging around while they expect the United States to do the fighting for them. And this messaging has also been accompanied by Trump's willingness to reach out to adversaries, like his brief outreach to Kim Jong from North Korea, and to actually talk to them and maybe try to find some way to end the military confrontation or whatever tension he finds. So in that respect, I think the United States has been signaling, especially under Trump, that it is looking to rationalize its overseas commitments. Within that rationalization, if you look at, let's say, the Trump administration, there are people in it who are more hawkish about China, in the sense that they consider China to be the real long-term threat to overall US international dominance. So if there is a rationalization of commitments in, let's say, Europe or the Middle East, the idea of that rationalization would be to then have more resources available in order to ensure that there is no change in the status quo as it currently exists in East Asia, that China, in effect, remains bottled up where it is, and the United States and its allies are able to focus upon that containment of the Chinese to essentially within the area around the Chinese homeland. So that would then maybe create a situation where Europe faces greater instability as European societies struggle to try and fill the gap that American reluctance to help them as they did before creates. It might lead to a spike in tensions in East Asia as the Chinese maybe feel the pressure of containment more acutely than they have for the last 20, 30 years. So, all of that essentially could play out. But at least the way I see it is that Trump wants the United States to remain number one. He feels that the existing architecture of global commitments inhibits American freedom of maneuver, and he would like to disentangle the United States from what he views as encumbrances that the United States has inflicted upon itself, because, as he so eloquently puts it, the people who came before him are incredibly stupid and dumb as they come, or the other adjectives he uses to describe them. So I think that is a kind of unilateralism that he wants to pursue. But that can actually then end up creating more instability by making Europe more vulnerable in some ways in the medium term, and by intensifying the risk of a confrontation in East Asia. So it's a very, very fraught situation. And in that fraught situation, I would again contend that it is powers that are willing to seize the initiative that might have an advantage.
No, so I think you already. I was going to ask you if this Trumpian strategy is viable, but I think you've already implied that it might not be. Let's talk about emerging technologies and their military applications also, and the entanglement of nuclear and conventional forces. Interestingly, and this is something which is now being talked about. It should actually be talked about more strongly, especially given India's very destabilizing, risk-prone strategy, that even when you keeping the nuclear weapons away, if you're fighting a conventional war, and I'm not talking about large massings of troops on land, even selecting target sets and engaging them, you might end up basically destroying command control communication centers and infrastructure, which is used not just for conventional capabilities but also for nuclear capabilities, forcing the state which is being hit to figure out whether it wants to use them or lose them. So there's a lot of danger inherent in that. So, and if you then add emerging technologies into the kill chain, like artificial intelligence and the rest of it, the situation becomes even more destabilizing. Do you think that this model, which India is kind of introducing in South Asia, can also be picked up elsewhere, and making the even the extra-regional areas more unstable, more dangerous?
Well, I mean, the basic thing is that, let's say, when you look at the Israel-Iran conflict,
Yeah,
notwithstanding the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons,
yeah,
a decent number of Iranian missiles hit them. and appear to have hit them in pretty sensitive installations and in very important places. At the beginning of the Iran-Israel conflict, one of the Fox News channels was very active on the ground, but then they disappeared for obvious reasons. And they were actually showing some of the destruction where it appeared the Iranians had managed to strike right at the heart of the Israeli military command facilities. So I think this is a very interesting thing, that when conventional deterrence, as we would understand it, that if you have nukes, you consider yourself safe from certain types of things like, enemy lobbing missiles at you. If that is no longer the case, then what are the risks that creates? Because traditionally, you would think that nuclear powers would be so terrified of the risk of an accidental or deliberate escalation to that threshold that they would avoid getting onto the ladder in the first place. But instead, what we're now seeing is, particularly with regard to India and Pakistan back in May, that and you also argued this in your recent article as well, that the Indian leadership seems genuinely convinced that nuclear weapons can provide a limit to conventional escalation rather than being something that naturally goes from conventional to nuclear. So in their thinking, now it seems that nuclear weapons help make the world safe for conventional warfare. So that is a really dangerous type of thinking, not in the context of India or Pakistan or the disagreements between the two countries, but because that dramatically increases the risk of a nuclear war. So I think that this sort of brinksmanship or this sort of destabilization could likely get worse as you have more proliferation of advanced systems. It could also get worse as existing powers with big nuclear arsenals surrender more and more of their military decision making to AI or AI guided systems that then feed the human principles a view. And, it's fascinating that if, let's say, the Americans have an AI and the Russians have an AI and the Chinese have an AI, and each of the AIs is aware of each other's existence and is trying to trick the other AI into revealing things about its behavior, you could end up in this absolutely, Skynet type situation where the AIs essentially start triggering false alarms in order to get some sort of action from the other side. So, it's and the speed with which the AI can consume data and report is just so much greater than what a human analyst or even a whole room full or a building full of such analysts can manage. So this is all extremely, extremely frightening and extremely destabilizing.
No,
So
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, it's all up in the air.
This is a very important point with reference to AIs actually dealing with this, because if you look at that Matthew Broderick film, 1983 film, War Games, you have WARP, this supercomputer that decides how it's going to operate, and it decides that it's actually going to start a nuclear war. And then the way they bring in the game, I think it was called Tic Tac Talk or something, and they start playing it, and it's supposed to end up in draws. And ultimately, the supercomputer learns that and says the only winning strategy is not to play. And I think that is something which needs to be rethought, because it's very important. Finally, one conversation, and I know you're very passionate about it, and frankly, so am I. One conversation that is actually not happening, and that's the gray rhino. climate. As a matter of fact, Trump has obviously come and said that this is all BS. There is no climate emergency. And a lot of his MAGA crowd and also right wingers elsewhere in the world also think that. In any case, whatever has been happening, for instance, the militaries are not even part of those pacts in terms of detailing and revealing how much pollution military operations and military activity actually does to the planet. So while we are talking about all these new nationalisms, we're talking about these emerging technologies and growths in the in the way that we've been looking at it, in the capitalistic way they've been looking at it for such a long time. Where exactly is this going? I mean, I referred to your book, Downfall. Where do you think it's going?
I think, it's one of the points that I often make is that there are no geopolitics on Mars because
Correct.
nothing lives there.
Yeah.
So, in order for there to be a new Cold War and for somebody to win that Cold War, you need a livable planet on which that Cold War can be fought.
Correct.
So even if the Chinese and the Americans decide that we're going to Cold War the heck out of each other for the rest of this century, they should first save the planet and then go about fighting their Cold War against each other, so that there is actually a place for them to win over. But what we instead see is that the way that decision making is structured in all states is that a very high priority is accorded to certain types of threats, military or security threats, and a very low priority is accorded to any sort of long term threat that is of a more abstract nature, where the feeling is that, well, the cost of dealing with this threat will be very, very high and hard to explain. And who knows if we can't maybe find some technical solution to this problem, some sort of magical new technology or something to that effect that will allow us to continue with the business as usual.
Yeah.
So that inertia of large organizations, of states, of leaders uh, creates this irrationality that, well, we are destroying the planet, that we want to lord it over. And if you destroy the planet, then everybody is dead and nobody gets to lord it over anything.
Yeah.
So that uh, rationality seems to have eluded us. And now I would argue that the amount of environmental damage that has already been done is so extensive that we are pretty much locked into a plus 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warming trajectory, uh, even in the best case scenarios.
Yeah.
And what that means for nearly all of the world's agrarian heartlands is that they will become progressively unable to sustain intensive agriculture over the
Yeah.
next few decades. So once you can't feed yourself, then all sorts of other terrible things start to happen. The population
Yeah.
destabilizes, societies collapse, economies crumble. Uh, and in that chaos, God knows what sort of dystopian alternatives might emerge. But
Absolutely.
certainly, our existing architecture of dealing with things is not going to survive very long if we
Absolutely.
ignore this problem. But we seem determined to ignore this problem. So, I mean, at this point, it really is just a question of making these observations for the record
Yeah.
rather than expecting anyone will hear what people like, let's say, Carl Sagan were talking about 40 years ago and act on their advice.
Absolutely. No, this is a structural problem, which is why it's the gray rhino. I mean, you can see it coming, but you're still not going to do anything. Partly because of collective action problem, partly because of how we have structured ourselves, partly because of the fact that how do we downgrade our lives, which obviously modernity has become so, we become so used to it that it's very difficult to go back. Which is why I think for those viewers of this program who have not read Downfall Lessons for Our Final Century, this is a book which is available online. You don't have to spend any money. It's a brilliant book by Dr. Ilhan Niaz, and it lays down different scenarios. And it's a great read, and it's not a turgid read. So if you haven't read it, I'd strongly recommend that you do. Thank you so much, Ilhan, for your
Thank
insights.
you.
It was a pleasure. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button and send us comments. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.